Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm really excited to be speaking with Craig Morris and Elliott Newell. Guys, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Hello.
Hi Dan, thanks for having me.
Well, it's welcome back to one of you, Elliott. Good to have you back. And welcome onto the show, Craig. Let's start by getting you, Elliott, to reintroduce yourself to the audience.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for having us back, Dan. It's not often I get an invite back to places, so appreciate that. I'm Elliott Newell. I'm a sports psych by trade, but I work in the performance path team at the English Institute of Sport, which is a bit of a hybrid team across the EIS and UK sport. So my EIS work is focused on helping coaches with curriculum and talent development. And my UK sport work is around helping have like a psychologically informed system. So we do our best to make sure that people in the system are looked after and athletes in particular have a good journey ahead of them.
Fantastic. And Craig, tell us all about yourself.
Yeah, welcome. Thanks for having me. Delighted to get the opportunity to talk to you both today. I'm Craig Morris. I'm a canoe slalom coach with British Canoeing. Currently working at sort of podium Olympic level. Fortunate enough to transcend the pathway through my ever-elongating career. And a former colleague of Elliott's, in fact. So looking forward to sharing some stories around that stuff today. But yeah, Dan, I guess I'm pretty fascinated with people, full stop, in any domain. And kind of addicted to learning. So I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot today, so delighted to be here. Thank you.
And it's been a busy period for you, Craig.
It has, yeah. So back from Tokyo, kind of reflecting on life after Olympics. And we're currently our fly out to the World Championships with the team tomorrow. So obviously being an unusual Olympic year, we also have a World Championship. So yeah, just letting things come down and then sort of recalibrating our motivation and direction into Slovakia next week.
Over the last few weeks on the Sports Psych Show, we've been talking to a few people who have been involved in the Olympics, past and present. So it'd be good to catch up with you, Craig, about your experiences at the Olympics, the psychological side of things, and also with you, Elliott, going into the Olympic Games, the pathways you were working in. But I think it would be pretty remiss of me not to talk about this weekend's actions. And I say this weekend, we're recording on a Monday morning. We have a new British champion in tennis. Emma Raducanu won the US Open over the weekend. Just incredible stuff. I've written a bit about this. I've been thinking a lot about it. I'd never heard of Emma Raducanu prior to Wimbledon. Did you both see that final, or have you been following the progress over the last couple of months and in the US Open of Raducanu?
I have to say, tennis is one of those sports that I have very little investment in unless there's a final one, and I'll just join in for the final. So yeah, similar to you, Dan, I wasn't aware of Emma until Wimbledon, and then I hadn't really followed much of the tennis up until the point where it's starting to get to quarters, semis, and you're getting excited with the anticipation that you might have British representation in the final. So yeah, I just jumped in for the end bit. And what a match it was.
Craig, have you been following it?
Yeah, I did. Well, it's similar to Elliott. I'm a bit of a patriotic tennis fan. So yeah, if there's British interest in the final stages, I'm there roaring at the TV. Yeah, glass of wine in hand with a friend Saturday night. Fascinating. I just thought it was an exhibition of. I don't watch a lot of tennis, but I thought, I was impressed by the standard for that level of competition. Obviously, great to have crowds back and to have two young ladies just performing at that level in that environment. And the whole package for me, I guess, the highlight, as has been well spoken about online, was kind of the reflections post-match were of real intrigue. And I guess a lot of people are pulling on threads that we might look at today with that. But it was fascinating. And congrats to both players. I thought they put on a great show.
Yeah, they did. And I suppose I bring this up not just to celebrate it, but to potentially investigate this just a little bit closer. And again, we don't have to be too tennis specific here, but I've done some work with tennis players. I did a little bit on the behest of the LTA a few years ago. I've done some work on the satellite tours, so I have some knowledge and experience in this area. But I think what fascinates me, I think to the lay person looking from the outside in, as I've mentioned, Emma Raducanu has just I suppose, come out of nowhere. But as two people who have worked closely with athletes in talent pathways who have gone on to become some of the best in the world, I think it's fascinating, isn't it, guys? I think three things are really interesting here. Three phenomenons. Number one, that she was clearly very good, very young. I mean, yes, she's come out of nowhere, but she was winning tournaments young. She played multi-sports, which is another interesting factor. She when she turned pro, she started to play mini tour events, satellite events. She got better. She didn't. Her progress didn't halt, which I think so many young athletes in all sports, they get to a certain level and then the progress plateaus or slows down. But she's just continued to get better and better and better. And then the final thing is she's able to perform under pressure at the very highest level. So those three phenomena, she's very good. She's continued to get better when so many fall away. And she can perform under pressure. And there's so much that goes into those three things, but those are the three things that really hit me. So no question there, guys, but you must see perhaps the opposite or similar factors going on in talent pathways that you're involved in.
Yeah, I think, we don't know enough about Emma yet and her journey and what she'll grow into. She might well be a unicorn. And there is always a danger of trying to base a pathway on a unicorn. Sometimes people come through and they're absolutely incredible. And the best thing I find is just get out of the way. Get out of the way and don't interfere and let people be and support them as much as they can. Like I said, we don't know whether Emma's going to be a unicorn yet. She's started incredibly and I wish her every success. One of the things that does become a little bit of a danger is when you get an example like this, people start to get really curious around what did they do and how can we replicate that for our new batch. But my experience working across multiple sports pathways has been that quite often people start good, as you say, Dan, but they do plateau and they do dip back and they do face challenge and they do face adversity and in some instances trauma and lack of motivation or whatever it might be. So it's not to say that you have to have this really smooth pathway through. You have to have a similar experience to what Emma's had if you're going to be successful. There are multiple ways to become successful in the end. We're aware, like we say, of unicorns like Emma, but there are in the smaller percentage far more common of people that struggle and fight and wrestle through pathways. They dip in, they dip out, they have moments of acceleration, they have moments of challenge. So I think enjoy them when they appear, but don't go chasing them is my advice.
What I'm hearing there before we come on to you, Craig, is complexity, is individual difference, being wary of modelling on a case study of one, essentially.
Yeah, because it's so tempting, isn't it? It's like, you see someone who's just a remarkable level of performance. And I know we haven't quite got onto her attitude and approach yet. I found some of her comments and interviews remarkable for a young person so far. And it's just tempting to get into that, but it's probably a space where you're best off just sitting back and enjoying rather than running into and trying to figure out and then replicate.
I'd like to explore some of the things that she has said about her sort of performance philosophies. But Craig, did you have any thoughts yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'd have so many questions rather than opinions. And I think that's the danger of social media. I think you guys have hit it on the head. There is no template. A case study of one is a dangerous precedent. I'm thinking back to the experience. I'd want questions around the experience of her medical retirement in Wimbledon, a narrative, a story around that, how the transference into the US Open happens, because it's not just a case study of one, it's a moment in time and hopefully a very small instance in time throughout a wonderfully flourishing career for her. So I think that's really important, understanding the support networks, the narrative, the social side of it. We should just enjoy what she's doing right now. And like Elliott said, get out of the way a little bit, but ask questions, I think, but not hang our processes and our direction on that in some sort of copy and paste world. I think it's it's just understanding and enjoying. And obviously, fingers crossed, she'll get a tour card now, and her form of life may well very change, which is really interesting. We hear a lot about this coined phrase of the resilience of youth and how that's shaped over time as experience grows. So yeah, just observing really, Dan, and not hanging hats on pegs we've seen in many sports. And Elliot and I have been involved in some those unicorns, as he calls it, who are hitting the success early, and those who maybe do it a very different way. And I think it's extremely individual, and we need to pay adherence to that.
I do wonder if she's a unicorn within unicorns at the moment. It's quite extraordinary what she's achieved. And coming to your point, Elliot, about the narrative around her performance philosophy, some of the things that she said in her press conferences, in her interviews, have been quite striking, certainly for sports psychologists. I mean, for me, listening to some of the things she said could be extracts out of a sports psychology manual: control the controllable, staying in the present moment, focusing on me, focusing on the now. I suppose well-worn cliches because they probably, to a greater extent, ring true when it comes to high performance. I think what's interesting to me, Elliot, is that a lot of athletes, competitors use these terms, but really, in my experience and respectfully, struggle to actually enact these terms, go out and do them. She says it, and she seemingly, at least from the outside looking, she's seemingly able to do these, to embody these performance philosophies. What's your thoughts on some of the things that she said?
Yeah, I really... Sorry, I'm mildly distracted by this idea of a unicorn within a unicorn, and I'm trying to wonder what a multicorn would actually look like and what that means for practice. My mind is blown. But to answer your question, I think you hit the nail on the head with that word embodiment, because you guys will know, being psychs or working with psychs, like most of the work is talking. And most of the work is talking and trying to create experiences for people that allow them to connect words with a state of being. So, I mean, I've lost track of the amount of stuff that I've tried to share and influence coaches and athletes to take on board. But until they actually take that in, digest it, and start living it, and as you say, Dan, embody it, then all it becomes is like a philosophical, conceptual, and sometimes even a frustrating experience, because you end up just talking to people about what they should believe in, which is a really tough thing. And there's an athlete that Craig and I shared some support experience with, and that I remember saying something pretty much line for line that Emma said, which was around comparing your results against others is the thief of happiness. And I remember that experience being quite a bit of a long process for someone to take that advice, but then really start to understand and connect and make sense of, well, what does that mean for me as an idea, but then what does that mean for me in this moment? And then how do I start living it to the point where I don't even really need to think about it anymore, and I can be interviewed or I can talk to a coach or a psych, and then I'm saying that back to them rather than them saying it to me. So that was the bit that I found really fascinating, because that was just one of multiple examples of where she'd said something that was just on the money for me. And you'd referenced quite a few of them, Dan, around staying in the present moment, focusing on yourself, being on your own journey, enjoying it for what it is. So it kind of prompted me to tweet something that got a little bit of a reaction, mostly in my DMs. But I'd said, people are asking, well, how has she learned to think like that? And I was more interested in, well, what didn't she learn along the way? And that was actually quite rightly, not corrected, but there was a few comments that evolved my thinking, and I wondered if there was also a process of learning and then unlearning stuff that allows you to be so young and to get into that place where you are, reflecting your philosophy back on the world in the way that she has done so far.
I noticed that tweet, Elliot, and I was going to DM you myself, actually, but I knew we were going to have this conversation today, but I did also notice that, Craig, you messaged Elliot to say, hey, this could be a great topic of conversation tomorrow. So, what was your thoughts on what Elliot said there in terms of what what hasn't she learned, or what has she had to unlearn?
Oh, I'm fascinated by it. I'm always fascinated by where the attention is. Like I see psychology a lot as where you're able to place attention, and based on intentions in any given context. And like I say, I'm cautious that this is one instance in time, and I feel very much, having been close to coaching for some time, I feel very much removed and don't want to overly speak for the Raducanu camp because I'm not close enough. So, and I think that's a word of caution, and I speak very much removing myself from the Emma story, is that there was some beautiful articulations. My favourite being just wanted to come out swinging, and it seemed to work. Fascinating one. I've heard very similar mannerisms or statements in canoeing. I think what is articulated is not often, as Elliott and you will know, Dan, is often not necessarily what's lived as well. You have part of being an elite athlete, or any athlete, is the ability to speak sometimes, particularly with media. And I'm fascinated by that journey because I've come to know that just because you're able to articulate those cliches and phrases doesn't mean you've had an immense struggle to embody them, or you're maybe just speaking because that's what you've heard in your recent psych session. So fascinated around that, and that's that process of learning and unlearning, I guess, very early in her career. But definitely that it's all contextual, and I think the social side, definitely around the Olympics, for example, the social factors were really prevalent as to where attention was able to be placed. And as we all know in life, it's one thing to know where we should be placing our attention, and we might come on to well-being and things like that, but it's a very different story to I guess, embody that and engage with that consistently over time around distraction and other factors. And yeah, that's why I'm fascinated with the Raducanu. I'd love to be close enough to the camp to understand the narrative from Wimbledon through Wimbledon into the US Open, and also where it goes beyond.
Well, I'd love to explore the social factors and how they mediated attention in the Olympics. Just finishing on this Raducanu story, and as you're both pointing out, ethically, it's so important to say, we're just guessing here. We're on the outside, and we don't want to do anybody within the camp a disservice. Least of all, Emma Raducanu herself, whose achievements should be absolutely celebrated. I mean, just incredible. I think intention and attention are really important, really interesting and important here. One of the things that we talk about embodying psychological processes in the moment and during difficult moments. I mean, when she cut her knee at a crucial time, and she had to go for a bit of a timeout, and she was asked afterwards, well, what were you thinking? Because I watched the press conference, and she was asked, what were you thinking? And she said she was just striving really hard to focus on what her next patterns of play were going to be. And it's like, wow, that to me is something that could be easily brushed over, but is such a accomplished way to direct attention. She's directing her attention onto the tactical, strategical side, allowing her to stay in the present moment, allowing her to focus on her own game, and doing that in that moment where it's all on the line. She's on the verge of victory. I mean, that's enormously challenging. Just so many things have come out of it where, again, we can all make assumptions, and we have to be very, very careful. But I suppose, I know, Craig, you're quite heavily into the ecological side of coaching, and as one skills acquisition coach said to me once, it's all about picking up clues. Attention, look for the clues, look for the clues, look for the clues. And I suppose in many respects that's the conversation we're having now, is what are the clues here in terms of what she's doing, and then therefore how can that inform our interventions, if you like, as psychs. No question, guys. I just think it's fascinating, and I think attention is a real mediator here. What is she focusing on? How is she focusing, and how is she flexing her focus?
No, it's fascinating, Dan. And what comes to mind when you talk about that is that sense of experience over time, that sense of referencing in different situations, different contexts, what best self looks like, and therefore where the search for information comes from to calibrate best self in different environments. And I guess, yeah, on the outside, it looked like she did that quite beautifully over the weekend. And, if we can cast aspersions from our ivory towers, it looked like Layla, her opponent, struggled to do that at times. Perhaps most obviously around that injury break. There was a level of agitation there, and you wonder where the differing attention. You've spoken there that Emma was very much on what's next, what's in front of me here, what's important to get the best self out. Whereas perhaps it was more evaluative from the situation from Layla. But again, we're casting aspersions and I'm no sports psych. But that sort of lines of inquiry there really fascinate me massively.
And I just think finally back to you, Elliot. There, I mean, I enjoyed your tweet, and it got me thinking. You took me away from my relaxing Sunday and got me thinking about the job as always. And it just made me think. It's like you said, almost our number one priority as psychs, as coaches, with that level of ability, or maybe even any level of ability, is what can I do that's not going to get in the way? Maybe that's our first port of call, and then it's what can I do to help this person in front of me, and maybe the first one comes loaded in the second one. Is to be able to help somebody, we've got to make sure that what we're doing isn't going to get in their way, and that's almost the craft of coaching, isn't it? It makes it so complex, so challenging, is that we actually don't want to introduce things that are going to disrupt progress, but it's also almost mission impossible at times.
Yeah. It makes me think about what is a natural state. I used the words pure and innate in my original tweet, and I guess what I was trying to do is just provoke a bit of a reaction around an idea that it is our natural state to be present and to be aware. And what gets in the way of that typically is the way in which the mind operates and the way in which the mind has evolved over someone's lifespan to be what it is at that time. Like, cognitions are great, but they kind of do your head in a lot of the time because they end up making things quite messy and they end up getting in the way a lot of the time, which is kind of why I was wondering, well, what is it that somebody experiences across a pathway over all those tennis training sessions, over all those junior matches, over all those interactions with parents and other competitors and coaches, and what happened that shaped the way in which that mind now operates, that doesn't mean that she's in that chair getting her knee patched up thinking, oh, I really need this break because the momentum's shifting, or prevents her thinking, I can't believe I've just missed an opportunity to secure this championship. And that was the bit. I wonder if most, and I'm really happy to be challenged on this. So even now, or if people want to listen back to this and get back to me, because I'm still figuring this out. But I wonder if the things that get in the way of us delivering a true, pure performance are these learned cognitions that get in the way at the moment of execution or just pre-execution. And I was just wondering, what didn't she learn along the way? Because I've worked with so many young athletes where you think you're so talented, you're so capable, but the thing that's getting in the way is the way that you think about this particular scenario or the way that you're thinking going into this performance, which is shaping where you choose to place your attention, which is shaping how you are perceiving this present moment. In layman's terms, it's overthinking or unhelpful thinking. And it just made me wonder, you've got an 18-year-old who's delivering performances like that, and is reflecting back to us that the way in which he's enabling that to happen is to have these attitudes or these perceptions or these attentions that are present moment focused, not getting ahead of herself. It's made me wonder how much of that is because people didn't get in the way, or maybe she chose not to listen. And we're getting too into the example. I guess what it was more was a platform for me to think more broadly. But yeah, I'm conscious I'm waffling now, so I'm just going to throw that over and see if any of that had any any sense in it.
Oh, it really does, Elliot. I think, our interactions with athletes, all of us, I think it's not to say that she wasn't sat in the chair having information come in that was evaluative or if I win this, what happens if, I guess it's that attachment, it's that ability to be present and make a choice. and place attention, isn't it? And I think quite often, as we'll see, and I'm sure Emma's been there, as many athletes are, sometimes you're able and you're in that mindset and you've worked hard enough and trained hard enough and experienced these challenges to be able to place attention in an approach mindset, rather than maybe let it rally across you and wash across you and attach to things that are probably less conducive to what's next. The old Arna concept of do the next right thing, or be more Elsa is a phrase I'm using these days with let it go. But it's not as simple as that, is it? It's often you've got to approach that information, approach those emotions to be able to then make a choice, and to be present. And that, as Dan said, part of that perhaps is, for me in coaching, it's through a pathway, and I've been fortunate enough to work with same athletes for a lengthy period of time. Is a lot about observing where the distractions are for different individuals at different times and what influences those. And then I guess as a team, sometimes you might seek permissions to actually present those distractions in training, either overtly or more inconspicuously. And we certainly did a lot of work of that in terms of, we call it simulation training. If something's going to get in the way, athletes actually can give you a good guess at what it could be, and they want to work on that, and they want those information sources to be present in certain training environments. Not always, because it's probably a little bit too stretched too often.
I think that's a neat segue into what you were doing. I mean, I love that notion of simulation training. Tell me a little bit about that for your athletes going into the games. Tell me about that, with what you were doing with the canoeists.
Sure, yeah, I guess it probably transcends all aspects of the sport, I think, Dan. In certain contexts, that will be quite refined to skill development, skill acquisition. In other elements, it's across the whole piece, socially, or, as we know, they're all influencing factors. For the games particular, I guess we'd worked as a team, and by that I mean very much a tight triangle, but beyond that, between psych, coach, and athlete. And really looked at establishing over years what best self is, where the anchors are to reference against processes and placement of attention. We do quite a bit of work around sort of super strengths concept, and what some challenges to that might be. And I guess over time, the athletes really gave themselves permissions to kind of acknowledge what the challenges would be to best self, what would be the real ones, and how that would conceptually look in an Olympic Games environment. Now, it is all their first Olympic Games, including myself, or was. It's obviously a very different Olympics. So a lot of that was theorizing, really, and very conceptual frameworks. But we then chose periods of time, like labeled and identified periods of time, when we would train that. Sometimes, like I say, with overt permissions. Sometimes staff members or team members were given permission to just slide things into the environment. And quite often, nobody knew what was coming, because that's the reality of life. Without going into individual detail, different permissions for different individuals. And when you do sort of a case study reflection on it at an individual level, you realize not only how they respond to different things, but the information sources that have an influence that are easier or more difficult to attach or detach from are very different for each person based on their form of life and everything that goes within that. And I guess Elliott and you have seen, like, even the calibration of that day to day, week to week, is very difficult. It can be very, very different. People can draw into best self very easy, but also they can find it very difficult, just depending on the context in time and space. But I think the important thing there was, and I'm fortunate to have done it over time with athletes, is they drove that process with support. So therefore, the permissions and the ownership and the determination was driven by them. So when they faced those, kind of fantasy sort of situations, they were very much driven by them. So the buy-in was there. It wasn't, I've heard the lines in the past of, this is getting in the way of my training. But I think the preparation involved in this context as a team meant that they were approaching, walking into the situation.
I'm going to go back on 5 words you mentioned a few minutes ago, which is, Craig, which was attention in an approach mindset. Attention in an approach mindset, which I think are 5 powerful words, or a powerful short sentence, which sums up 2 of the 3 mental skills that I think are very important for high performance: attention, intensity, and intent. So you mentioned attention in an approach mindset. So what I'm hearing you say there, to strip things back, is that going into the Olympic Games, you wanted to create a competitive environment, or a practice environment, I should say, that introduced obstacles, distractions that would play with canoeists' attention, that might put them in an avoidant mindset rather than approach mindset. And so subsequently you're helping them perform, build the capacity to perform under pressure. Would that sort of sum up what you were doing?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so, and I absolutely appreciate fully, as you mentioned, that you can't reference individuals and what they experience, but what would, if you were to help the audience visualize this, what kind of things? Because when I think of canoe, and I'm very much a layperson here, what would that, you're going down the course, and I'm guessing that you guys are putting certain things in. What kind of obstructions are you putting in the way to influence the attention and the approach mindset of the canoeist?
Yeah, let me just try and give maybe a little sample. So to follow that thread that you've said there, so let's come with a situation where a particular athlete, because we don't get to practice the course, we get to view it from the riverbank, kind of bird's eye view, but we don't get to practice it. Now let's come with a situation that there's a particular sequence of gates or a particular skill-based challenge in a course that will provoke anxiety, or will provoke a lot of information or an evaluation around decision making. So for us, it's sort of what tactical intention of route do I want to choose? So at risk again into jargon, it's, do I go straight, or do I have a safer option where I spin a move and face upstream? So little things like that, or it could be a particular challenging one side of their boat or the other. And an athlete may have said, well, like, there's a particular sequence on this course that if that is set, I know that's going to distract me from being present. I.e., when I'm sat on the start or in the lead up to the start, my mind is 60 seconds down that run. And what you often see, as Elliott will know, and I'm sure it's the same in many sports, I guess it might be the par 5 ninth, Dan. Getting over that water, I've shanked it every time off that tee in the last 6 weeks. And suddenly you find yourself double bogey in the first because your mind's on the ninth. So we might provoke some of those situations. And I think the key for practitioners here and coaches is the thorough debrief and the thorough preparation, and you're with them all through, non-judgmental. It's kind of like picking up on the threads of information together and learning as a team. Like we talk a lot about we in that context. In other aspects, it might be completely unrelated to the skill in the here and now, but it might be maybe more of a social thing. So, for example, obviously around coronavirus, there's a lot of preparation for us around what if a coach goes down, what if a key team member goes down. So, for example, I wouldn't be available to coach some days with no notice, and we put in a lot of social distraction to particular athletes, and we see how they calibrate, because certain people have said, right, well, yeah, without that guidance or that formal meeting with a coach, I don't think I focus as well on a race day. The little things like that. So it could be anything from skill-based things to social things to crowd noise to distractions from family and friends, commentary. A lot of people attend to we don't have huge crowds in canoe slalom, so the commentary is pretty overt, and people attach to that, and it's quite often really wrong, based on bad timing splits that are available to the commentator and things like that. And if you attach to that as information, suddenly you're not in the present. And things can unravel quite quickly. So a whole breadth of things. We would look at it from, as you've mentioned, Dan, I'm kind of really intrigued by an ecological approach. So in this particular example, we used it we mined this through a constraints approach. So we looked at the individual task and environmental factors and kind of said, where are we at our best, what could distract us, and we worked through those with some headlines, and we just pushed and pulled between us, and saw how that played out. I mean, and of course, it is simulation. Like one example, we worked a lot on, managed to get some commentary from the person who was commentating at the games, things like that. We played with crowds, not, and of course, we were left with no crowds. So, but again, it's all like just being present for the engagement around the reactions in a non-judgmental, non-threatening way, and kind of, okay, this is what happened today. Let's unpick that a little bit and see what it means for tomorrow.
That must be a blast from the past for you, Elliott, because you were involved in canoeing. Do you any thoughts from you? Plus, also, do you see this kind of preparation across pathways going into Olympic Games?
Yeah, lots of kind of nice memories there, because the sport is a sport, and even though it's been a couple of years since I was in there, there's lots of familiar things that Craig was describing there, and the bit I really latched onto was that term calibration, and I think it may well be true for a number of sports, but what I found in slalom was that you don't win against water really ever. So the best athletes, the best developing athletes, are the ones who've got that. I remember one athlete telling me on a competition day that the main aim of competition in slalom was just to be as least awful as everyone else. Because everybody makes mistakes, you don't get that perfect run. So the kind of framework that I was using at the time with these podium potential athletes was around how do we constantly recalibrate, given that we understand that the sport is going to knock us off. It's just the nature of it. It's not a cycling, it's not a closed skill that you can just deliver excellence. So we always had, well, where might I calibrate or recalibrate? So we had attention. What am I paying attention to? There was one which is perception, which is how am I choosing to perceive that at this moment? And then the other one was action, around, okay, well, what am I choosing to do with that at the moment? My favourite thing was these young paddlers that thought, I've made a mistake, I've lost 2 seconds, I now need to make up 2 seconds. It's well, time doesn't work like that. I'm sorry, that's not a philosophical thing, that's a physics thing. The best thing you can do is just go back to ordinary and continue to deliver your plan as best as you can. That mistake's gone. But what it did show, and this is why I absolutely loved working in slalom, is because you don't really get time to think, but you do think. And it drove a wedge between those instances where there was a kind of faulty attention perception. So something had knocked off plan. And then you had those that were able to skill their way out of it. They're actively thinking and actively choosing a particular way of thinking, or they're putting their attention deliberately onto something else. So it's quite effortful and it's quite skillful to touch a gate, know that you've got a 2-second penalty, but then recalibrate and go, right, now I'm going to focus on this. Versus the ones, to come back to your original term, embody, the ones where it wasn't effortful to get over a 2-second mistake, a 2-second penalty, because whatever they did in that moment, they just reconnected to the plan and went with it. So I guess where I was trying to get to was to help people understand, where do you put your attention? Because you're probably a little bit more in control of that than you might originally think. How do we choose to perceive and understand that information? Because again, we're probably a little bit more in control of that than we might think. But then also give people the skills and strategies in the moment when they need to be effortful, but ultimately trying to get people to a place where they embody whatever it is that they want to embody, where they can make a mistake or they can encounter something unexpected. And they are so present and they are so comfortable in that moment that they, so you excuse the pun, but they ride that wave and they just go with it. They're not deliberately thinking, oh, I have to save myself from this, or I have to do something different to get myself out of this sticky patch. They just find a way to reconnect. And so, yeah, lots of things that I was kind of connected and reflecting on there from Craig.
I think that's a really fascinating dichotomy that you've pointed out there, effortless versus effortful. And that some canoeists, and this would be across sports, because it's my experience as well. Some participants, competitors, canoeists in your case, are effortless. They can just do it, whether it's embodying it. They're able to flex their attention without really thinking about it, and that might be Emma Raducanu as an example. Whereas others are effortful, and have to go through almost like an active directive process to be able to shift their attention back onto their race plan, the technical execution, the task, whatever it might be. What I'm hearing you say, Elliott, is that in an ideal world, in your own mind as a sports psychologist, you potentially want to take the effort full and help them become effortless. Tell me if I've heard that correctly. And did you find any evidence when you were in canoe, or any evidence subsequently, that can take place? Or are we thinking that these, in very simple terms, are two types of sort of individuals, two types of people who approach things very differently?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, you mentioned Emma again, and that may well be Emma in that moment, in that point. There may be a time where she has been or will need to be effortful, and this is the bit I find fascinating. I really took it as a personal responsibility as a professional working with developing athletes. I needed to help people connect with both and develop their capacity in both. And because, I mean, it's so tempting, right? Like, you're working with a young paddler and they're just awesome. So you're like, you just crack on, mate. You do you, and it will be fine. And there were at least 2 examples of phenomenal young paddlers who, at the point of transition into senior, really, really struggled. Because the things, their environment, their mindset, whatever it was, their whole state of being, that allowed them to flourish in that junior environment were just fundamentally different in that senior environment. And all of a sudden they were like, okay, I can't just be, I can't be effortless. Whatever's changed, whether it's my environment, my relationships, my mindset, like, I now don't necessarily have those refined, effortful skills that I can lean on, because when I'm in that moment, what used to come so easy is now not there. And I don't really know what to do and how to handle that. So it's one of those dangers of having really smooth pathways. You like to put stuff in the way. I remember one kid who was like exactly that. When he was on the water, he was great. He flowed. There was just a bit of planning. It wasn't disengaged with psyche, engaged loads, but there wasn't a huge need to do stuff. So I'm there thinking, I'm not really sure how well this young athlete is finding opportunities to develop skill in being able to refocus or to deliberately control attention to recalibrate. So we used to just try and create scenarios outside. Like, the gym was a really good example. We'll try and give that example in the gym. We'd give him social situations. We'd put him in presentations, or just the whole thing. And it's never perfect. But we were like, I'm confident at some point in time, this athlete is going to need to be effortful in order to control performance. We're not really getting that in training at the moment or competition, because they're at such a level that they don't really need to lean into that. But I'm confident it's going to happen, unless this is a unicorn that I haven't yet identified. So I need to find different ways to help them connect with that, at least conceptually, and begin to practice some skills in some non-specific settings, so that when that time comes, I can say, hey, remember when we were getting really good at Jenga and you were good at controlling your attention? Or remember those things that we were doing in the gym with the S&C coach? The principle's the same. It's about losing attention and refocusing. And that's what I now need you to bring to the water, because your training environment has thrown up those scenarios that you now need to learn to deal with.
Building up some mastery experiences around attention. Very Albert Bandura, Elliott. Love it. Craig, coming to you there. You've listened to what Elliott's had to say. What's your thoughts, mate?
Well, firstly, I've got to pull him up. I think he just lost 1,000 Twitter followers this morning by calling cycling a closed skill sport. I can feel the onrush from all over the country on that one, mate. Just keep an eye on your followers when this is published. Fascinating and great provocation there, Dan. You know, is there such thing as a personality type of people who find life effortful or not? Effortless, great provocation. I think, I've never met them if there are. I think it's like, I was thinking before this session a little bit around like well-being and resilience, such abstract concepts that are really, really, for me, very contextual in life over time. And when I hear you guys talk here, like Elliott and I have worked on this sense of, it was through the Thrive years, Elliott, if you remember well, that sense of thriving or striving in personal well-being. And we talked a lot about calibrating to the signs through those times. And I think what I've just heard from you beautifully there is that when we're supporting people through a calibration process, it's important that we're moving with them, not in spite of them. So we don't sit in our ivory tower saying we want effortless practice here. And therefore, if we're calibrating and we're not seeing effortless practice, we're just constantly working towards it. We have to move with the situation, engage in it, kind of be the situation with them, and then look for those small next steps. I think rather than this, I've definitely coached like that years ago. I'll say pre you, Elliott, because it wouldn't do you justice if I said after you, but spent times, just trying to pull people to a mental position situation. But actually, experience tells us over time, well, A, that's not possible. We've got to move with and sit with at times. And I certainly become aware of that myself very much with my children, certainly my daughter's attention when playing Roblox seems perfectly effortless. And I'm sure the parents on this session will resonate with that. But in other contexts, very different levels of perceived effortlessness. I just think it's very contextual. I'm in a good place today on this call. I drop my kids off at school. I'm finding it really easy to be present in good company in a topic I'm passionate about. If you'd have got me, last week, maybe not. I think we need to be aware of that at a level of self as well as a level of others.
I think it's interesting because when we use this word context, if we're talking about Olympic canoeists, or we're talking about elite level athletes, my experience has been there's a real socialization in elite sport into a certain meaning of competitiveness or a certain meaning of preparation that, very simple tones, it's got to win, got to win, got to win, got to perform, got to perform, got to perform. This means everything to me. And it almost comes back to our first conversation we had way back when on the Sports Site show, Elliott, of perhaps redefining the meaning of your engagement in sport, even at the very highest level. But if we talk about context and actually relate it to personality traits, for me, it taps emotional instability or neuroticism, which is the horrible term we might use in personality psychology, and potentially, there are people out there who, at least I understand the empirical evidence suggests, that have a need for cognition, a need to think. And that might come under the rubric of openness to experience, the personality trait there. So I think when you're dealing with athletes on pathways, you're dealing with a lot of individual differences that, as you're saying, are going to be influenced by the context. So there is a lot of change. However, I do think in sporting pathways, in a sporting context, that socialization of got to, must, should, and around winning and high performance taps into our emotional instability. And so subsequently, it doesn't surprise me that a lot of athletes would say, wow, I've got to really put in a lot of effort to be effortless. I've got to really put in a lot of effort to shift my attention, to not be despondent and drop in intensity of attention when I'm competing. No question, just my ramble there, guys. But I just think it's fascinating, and my curiousness is such that I think, I suppose for my personal story, I would say, if we almost go full circle back to Elliott, back to your tweet, this notion of innate and natural, perhaps, if I was to be 100% honest, doesn't resonate with me so much, because my natural innate golfing state was one of being terrified and thinking everybody was better than me, and, as you eloquently put, Craig, shanking it off the tee into the woods, and making triple, quadruple bogeys. And actually having to put effort into embodying being somebody else has very much informed my active directive sports psychology consulting. However, my curiosity is such that I do understand this natural innate how do we create that? How do we help promote that in somebody? Again, just a long ramble, guys. Any thoughts coming back from you?
Yes, the bit that the only bits that I've ever found you have to hold quite dearly and hold close are what's the nature of the human condition? So what do we fundamentally believe it means to be human? And what are the implications of that belief on how we perceive humans to function? And then so you've got that as a starting point. Then you've got the bit like, what are the demands of the game? What does performance look like, and what are the performance demands, and what are the requirements of you? And similarly to Craig, I used to think that my role as a practitioner was to be like, thrash through the jungle and find the perfect path and be like, look, dude, it's fine, I've sorted it, just follow me, I'm going to take you to that. Where actually, the most joyous bit of the work is asking the question, who are you? Where have you been? What's happened to you? What have you got? And then how exciting is it going to be to work out what your journey to that level of performance is going to be like? So that big gap in the middle is so vast. And there are very few things that will fundamentally prevent you from being successful. And I've deliberately used the word successful because it's individually defined as opposed to winning. And I guess if I make space for that, then it occurs to me that there is that same level of joy to be found with those that are really cognitive by nature, that really want to be effortful, that their best version of self is, I'm just going to fight through it. Like a Nadal, like I love watching Nadal for his physicality and his intent. And then you get the ones that maybe the best thing you can do for them is help them learn to be effortless. So it doesn't come from a place of hard truth where you're like, non-negotiable, this is how you need to be. But I do come back to that idea that at this point in my life, my belief currently is that the nature of the human condition is that it's far more natural to be present, and it's the mind that gets in the way. But having said that, unless you're literally going to put people in protective environments from the day that they're born, you're always going to get someone that, we're all our own little levels of messed up, haven't we? We've had our own experiences, we've got all these beliefs, these patterns. That's the fun I find in coaching and providing site support for people. So whichever way you cut it up, whichever examples you choose to look at, there is space, I think, on this performance journey for basically anyone to get through to a level of success. The only bit that we've got to work out is like, what are the really hard lines which will prevent you from being successful? And just to give an example of one would be, if you are fundamentally unable to build trusting relationships with support staff and coaches, that will eventually prevent you from getting any real level of success or getting any kind of. So that would just be anecdote. So there are a few things, but most of the time we can flex and support. The reality is our systems, our funding, our staff and coach skill sets just aren't really there in some cases to give people what they need to be successful. And you've got to be, look, okay, this isn't going to work right now. But yeah, again, another waffle, but I just wonder whether that space in which we can play in and create for people to be themselves and then go on their individual journey is probably larger than you think.
What you remind me of there, Elliott, is that it's this concept of going beyond understanding. I think there's been a positive shift, or certainly I've been aware of it. Maybe I've just moved with it in terms of person-centered, individualistic, holistic. I think we can't stop at understanding, though. It's beyond understanding. We have to connect. We have to engage at an interpersonal level across the social paradigms and move with. Yes, that doesn't mean we're not stretching. Of course we're stretching, but we're stretching together rather than demanding stretch from others. And I think when you get to that level of interaction that you're talking about there, it's accepting of where people are at and calibrating with that and moving with them. Not pulling them to a predetermined space. I think I talk a lot about my best ever CPD was a terrifying improvised comedy session with Neil Malarkey down at the Comedy Store. He came in and he said something really profound to me in my first couple of years of coaching. He said, improvised comedy is all about the giving and receiving of offers. And he said, I see coaching very similar, and it's just always in my head. And, sometimes I'm really mindful that I'm not present enough to receive the offer and give one back in a conversation. So I'm not mastering the interpersonal connection, and that's a reflection on where my attention might be. So I'm always having those conversations myself of making sure we're present, because the best feedback or the best moments or memories I personally have ever had are relating to how you make, at risk of being cheesy and cliched, how you make people feel, rather than, standing with something around their neck or whatever it might be, or lifting a trophy aloft. So I think, going beyond understanding, and that takes skill, it takes time and experience, and it takes a good awareness of self, I think, as a coach or a practitioner or a psychologist as well.
I'd like to finish the last 5-10 minutes to reflect upon your experiences at the Olympics, Craig, if we may, and drawing upon something you said earlier around the social factors influencing attention. I'm assuming around the Olympic Village going into the events that your athletes were facing, and perhaps, Elliott, you can contribute here by some of the conversations you had in some of the pathways. I know you weren't directly involved with the Olympics, but you do work with talent pathways across sports, and so I'm sure a lot of the work you were doing, the conversations you were having, revolved around the experiences that coaches were going to have at the Olympic Games, possibly. So Craig, I mean, whether it's just drawing generally on your experience of your first games, I mean, talk to us a little bit about that. And talk to us a little bit about, what you experienced in terms of the social factors. The factors, I suppose, again, the viewer doesn't necessarily consider when they're watching the finals, when they're watching the gold medal run, etc., etc.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I mean, it was an incredible experience. Our aspiration was to create memories, and I think, we lived to that. I think one of the most profound things that I've been reflecting on, Dan, and it's probably a personal one, and then so direct me towards athletes more if you wish, but is the real clinical different transitions that took place in this particular games. So for me personally, like that, I've been trying to make sense of that period. In the first 2 weeks were in a really tight canoe slalom bubble, international bubble, single room, nice hotel, all the time in the world. Couldn't do anything with it other than, battle your jet lag and watch England's semi-final of the World Cup or something like that. Then 2 weeks in, you go into the village. Suddenly we're in a really small apartment, kind of like a cabin cruise ship budget apartment with 7 colleagues, and you're on top of each other for 2 weeks into the competition. And then I come home and I've got a few weeks off, fortunately, with the family. So then all the time in the world, no work to do, but no time to myself. And those transitions, I think, for each of us, be it athlete, practitioner or coach, were really noticeable and very profound for me, and we'd prime for those. I think going a layer deeper into the games itself, I think because not many people get to hear about the village, I guess, so I'd probably like to talk a little bit on that. It's my first experience of the village was a very long queue to get accredited. And I'm about 5'8", and to my left with the American volleyball team, minimum height, I don't know, 6'7", crouch style. And to my right with some rowing coxes, and I don't know how different in height they are, but they're certainly smaller and significantly smaller than 5'8". And I just remember thinking, wow, this is just like the polarization of sporting humanity in this place. And a few little things like that. And one word of advice for anyone who's fortunate enough or works to get to an Olympic Games is don't go running in the village for a jog once the athletics teams have arrived, because the middle distance African women were out when I went for a run, and my word, that gave me perspective on what jogging or running or walking is. But the social ones were really, like we talked about simulation training, Dan, I guess the social ones were really profound at this Games, because we never quite knew what the social situation would be until the last moments, be that family and friends, which is a big factor, depending on people's networks, the stability of the networks, how they've engaged through their career pathway. The presence of family and friends is a massive factor, or even to know that they're there, whether they're remote or not. And the time zone coupled with not having them present and then you talk about whether you kind of are this sort of athlete who engages socially on social media or you pull away. It's a real push-pull around trying to make the games normal, but equally you're aware that it's anything but normal. The whole thing is created to be abnormal in its processes. So I think some of the push and pulls and the strains and how people calibrate to some of those social challenges or the information that comes in socially is obviously, as we've talked today, depends on how they're calibrating their attention through that journey. So it may come easy at different stages. It may just suddenly pop up to be really difficult on a given day. And that might be a qualification day. It might be the day before while you're itching to compete or fearful of competing. Or it might be at the opening ceremony when, there was obviously a lot of evaluation. Like I say, the people we went, the whole team was first-time games athletes. And so you're trying to have an intention of living the experience as a fresh for you as your games. However, there's always evaluation. And I think evaluation is it's a useful source of information, but I think it's one of the most dangerous sources of information psychologically in doing anything, let alone in doing performance sport. To evaluate against something you wanted to happen, expected to happen, or thought might be like something else. And I think the social aspects of that were a real factor with time zones and everything else. I'll maybe hand that thread back and we can explore it a bit more.
Elliott, I know you weren't directly involved with the Olympic Games, but did some of what Craig say there resonate with you in terms of some of the conversations you've had in some of the talent development pathways?
Yeah, and I wasn't directly involved, but I'm fortunate enough to kind of interact with a few people across our high performance system, and as they go into and as they experience, and in my private work supported a couple of athletes who went out there, so a little bit of a sense of what it was like for people. I guess what Craig provoked me to think is that we create room for evaluation, don't we, when there's a gap between expectation and reality. And I'd always thought differently about these games because I think people are remarkably adaptable when they can get stuff on a head level about why things will be different, while there'll be no crowd, while I won't be able to interact as much, while I might have to be in confined spaces. But for the vast majority of people, this has been like a very, very long and arduous, meaningful journey towards something that was fundamentally different to what you planned for. And that was, with both the athletes I worked with, that was their biggest thing to try and wrestle with. Like, I'd spent so long trying to get there, and I got there, and then it wasn't as I thought it would be. And all of this is kind of like, it's not really a performance thing. It's like a well-being experience thing. It's like, how do you support people to maintain a high level of well-being, which I'll just qualify as the experience and also the level of functioning someone has. How do you keep someone in a well place that they can deliver a performance when there are so many things that are just different to what they had expected? And particularly on the social side, like, I'd heard so many interviews where friends and family were referenced, or when my coach has been there for me, but my coach is at home. Or, the most striking example for me would be Jay Jones in the Taekwondo, who was kind of favourite going in for gold and went out in the first round. And she gave a really powerful and emotive interview about how destructive it was for her to not see her family in the crowd and to not have a crowd. So all those social things are like really important because they sound a little bit nicey, but they fundamentally change the state of being of someone, who they are when they turn up and the environment that they turn up in, which if we can't see the profound impact that has on their performance, then I don't think we really get it. Like, all of that is really important. And the most kind of relevant thing to that I've heard is for those that were involved in the village and the way that GB had set stuff up, I've heard nothing but really positive things about the great job that Team GB and the VOA did, specifically reference to the Olympics, around how they made that a home from home and how they tried their best to try and normalise what was quite a complex situation. And there's just been a lot of appreciation I've heard from people who have been in that environment and go, yeah, it was a bit weird, but fair play. They tried to do this and they tried to do this, which actually had a really positive impact on my interactions, my state of being while I was there, which then we think led to some good performances. Because, I mean, they did great, all right? Like, across the board, like Team GB and Paralympics GB delivered some amazing performances. So yeah, you can get that situation where you've got high levels of well-being and performance, you get high levels of well-being, low levels of performance. You can also have high levels of performance, low levels of well-being. So it's really important that we pay attention to both. But ultimately, you can perform without some of that stuff. And it comes back to that philosophical discussion around, like, well, what is it we're trying to support people to do? Is it, it's turning up and performing a state of doing, or is it a state of being? And, follow your nose on your answer to that question will probably lead you to some answers.
Well, just coming straight back at you there, Elliott, because I think this is fascinating. I think I heard you define sort of well-being as what somebody's experiencing and how somebody's functioning, and this is a games. I've spoken to a few people on the Sports Site show about this over the last few weeks. This is a games that might be remembered for maybe a bit of a paradigm shift, that even in the general public there's an attention, if we're going to use the term attention placed towards well-being as well as performance. Behind the scenes, you're involved in high performance systems, Elliott, across pathways right the way through to elite. I mean, is that language changing? Because I suppose there's controversy here. There's always going to be people who say, well, Olympics, Olympians, elite level sports people, they've just got to go out and perform. There are people within, say, sports psychology who might be more oriented towards performance more so than well-being. And I'm not saying that those people would say well-being is not important. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that they might argue that we have to be oriented towards performance because that's what we exist for at the adult elite level. However, I suppose my question to you, Elliott, is working behind the scenes. Have you found going into the Olympics, during the Olympics, after the Olympics, the conversations are expanding around performance plus well-being, or well-being a part of performance, that well-being really is something that systems are taking into account and really doing something about?
Oh yeah, totally. I've been nothing sort of inspired by some of the work that's going on in this area, and I think it's always one of those cases where the people who get it, and you just give them license to just go and pay more attention and do better work. But it was never a conversation for me in canoeing. I spent 5 years in canoeing. It was just the way that you worked, right? Particularly in slalom. It's part of the performance conversation. We used to have a saying, better people make better paddlers. Like, you support people to do well. And it was never a controversial thing that if someone was low or not feeling well that day or weren't on form, that you tweak the training session, or you gave them some time off, or they tweak the, like, it's just a way it works, right? The key bit is getting into people who don't really understand. So, Craig, you might be able to speak a little bit more about this, but I'm aware of the performance wellbeing group in canoeing that do some brilliant work in terms of strategizing and operationalizing a mental health and wellbeing strategy. And it's just given a sport like that wings to go and do the things that are already meaningful to them. It's not where you're coming into an environment where there's such a lack of awareness of health and wellbeing that they're putting stuff into remedy. That's where I get concerned, where it's like, oh, okay, mental health is really important now. We've never really done anything like that. So what we're going to do is create a mental health steering group. It might be the first step potentially, but we don't tend to have. I'm guessing you don't change culture through direct and obvious interventions like that. You build it from the ground up. So when I see a performance wellbeing group in a sport, where I'm like, you've not done anything in this area. It looks and feels and has a very different function and impact to a performance wellbeing group in a canoeing, where you're like, actually, you guys have been doing this really well for a number of years, and this is just giving you wings to do work with even more impact in this area. But yeah, I don't know, Craig, what do you think?
No, I mean, it's very flattering, thank you. But I think I would say, individually and collectively, we can still do a lot more. I guess I see well-being as, kind of think of it a bit more abstract, as I like to, a bit more fluffy, if you will. There's nothing wrong with fluffy. It's like how the story of taking up with the world is narrated by us. And I think what you've touched on there, Elliot, in my experience, and I used to be the guy who would sit down with teams and put values and behaviours on the wall, and I've moved away from that. I think now, I think I've come to experience, come to learn that a system can't create a culture, but it can influence a culture. But it's actually the people and the behaviours and the actions and the stories and the connectivities that create a culture from the bottom up, not top down. And I think what we started to see is a paradigm shift from top down imposed cultures to more open-minded, organic cultures, and we've got to start getting things off of surveys, off of questionnaires, off of stickers on the wall into our recruitment, our stories, telling. What I've really enjoyed about the games, and again, I mean, Elliot, you'll know, one of our athletes of the games had quite an adverse experience around one of the competition days. And the response to that individual, both on the ground in Tokyo and globally, was absolutely profound in terms of mental well-being. And I know that individual felt incredibly supported in terms of one of the best experiences of their life during one of the most difficult experiences of their life. And I think that's the change in narrative in sport. You see a lot more. You see Ben Stokes now publicly taking time out, other massive characters that it's spoken about, and we don't. I hope there's less judgment, but I still hear it going back full circle to Raducanu. I read very different headlines. Wimbledon, when she had the medical retirement, isn't it? To what we're hearing now in the post-match interviews. And I think we've just got to be careful to not create these black and whites when we don't live the context on the ground. It's too easy our culture to judge, but I think we are now having a sense that we're more open-minded to different people's journeys and different people's whys, for sure. Let's be clear, if someone in my team is motivated to win, I'm going to walk with them on that journey of winning. I'm also going to mine some richer journey experiences and life experiences to calibrate that confidence over time, knowing that we can't always win, and that we need to kind of grow for wider life skills as well. Because I think one of the challenges of more professional elite sport cultures that I think you would resonate with, Elliot, is that they are more and more living in a bubble, and that a part of our job as practitioners or colleagues is to help together grow experience for life beyond the bubble. Because as you talked about, even the transition from junior to senior, but the transition from sports person to more general life, if there is such a term, is a massive one that we need to develop skills that transcend.
And I think when you look at those examples, Craig, if it's a truly high-performing system, then I think what we're doing is supporting people to realise their potential as a whole holistic being. Because a life in sport is necessarily challenging. We hear it all the time: high challenge, high support. The level of personal functioning to be able to engage with that and to maintain a positive personal experience and not get kind of downtrodden and beaten or overly anxious by that. That's like you're pushing on the edges of human capacity there. That's really tough. That's a really clear level of self-awareness, personal and other regulation. There's a whole load of stuff. That's an exciting place to be in when you were supporting people's holistic functioning, because that then helps you deliver those great training sessions and have those great competition experiences. And Dan, we talked on the last time I was on the show, it was all about trying to clear the noise, as we called it, because you're putting on a tough training session. People need to be able to come and deal with that. And it's not beat them down because they can't. It's support them to be the best version of themselves so that they can really drain that training session for all the learning that is possible for it. So I think it's, when we look at what's the state of people when they leave, if all you've ever done is train someone to be really good at performing, then I worry for those people. And we've had so many examples of when they just go out into the real world and it just slaps them around the face because they haven't got the experiences or the skills. But I think if you're really living a high-performing culture and you are developing high-performing people through your process, through your program, then they're equipped with a whole range of skills that allow them to cope with life. And that might mean you letting go a little bit and letting them just go and live life. And I do worry, as Craig says, because our system now in some cases has kind of evolved. I don't think it was ever really set up for people to do 3, 4, 5 cycles, but you've got some people coming in as kids and leaving as adults, and you're like, okay, so never had a job. You've never really gone out and done anything. The program is basically catered for you your whole life. And that's the bit where holistic functioning becomes so important. If you are going to reduce the number of real life experiences someone can have, and you have to find a way to find those in sport. And sport is such a rich breeding ground for learning about life that I think the potential for us to make real advantage of that is just there, ready for the taking. But we've just got to break some of these patterns, these cultural bits where it's like, people have got to work until they're kind of like broken because that shows that you want it, and all of that stuff, that you've got to like box off any negative emotion or challenge because that means you're not a winner. All of that stuff needs to change if we are going to really see this high performing culture rather than just a high performance one.
I think what I'm hearing from you both, picking up on your last term there, a high performing system involves performance, well-being and mental health. At the heart of that lies the person, their experience, their functioning. What I'm hearing from you both, for us to be able to appreciate that within the systems, we need to celebrate individual differences. We need to celebrate individual differences in the stories that are evoked from individual differences. Speaking on the Sports Psych show around culture with Suze Burton-Wiley from British Sailing, recently with Niels Feddersen, both of whom would, I suppose, agree with you, Craig, in terms of, a system might choose to look at values and behaviours, and I know that you haven't, but actually we might look at values and behaviours from a exploration around individual differences and individual similarities, rather than these are must adhere to values and behaviours. So it's almost a shift around of why we're doing that, and so subsequently we have a very rich system that enables us to appreciate the individual and enables us to coach holistically. To finish off, would I be hearing you correctly there? And any final thoughts yourselves, Craig?
I think in a beautifully articulated 25 seconds or so, Dan, you've probably epitomised some of the shifts of my career, if I would feel bold to call it something like that. My journey through coaching, my ongoing journey through coaching has been very much that. And yeah, not to go off on a tangent, but part of that has been, yes, studying psychology, not professionally or academically, but just with intrigue and curiosity, and immersing myself around some excellent practitioners, but also studying motor learning as a coach and things like that. And just those appreciations have I guess, drawn me to look at things through a different lens and a much more egoless lens, I think, which is a big part of culture. I think it's a big part of how we can connect together is that we acknowledge ego, but we're able to place it in the right position to allow people to engage and connect and explore themselves and each other. So yeah, that is something we're constantly striving to, and I make mistakes around on a daily basis. We've talked about that. I'm not immaculate at placing attention myself, as I don't expect anybody else to be. But it is a journey towards that sense of understanding, but then what we do with the understanding, I think, is critical. And we've touched on hopefully some really nice threads of how we can go about that within individual connections or within systems today.
Finish us off, Elliott, with some wise, eloquent words.
I was just thinking, I hope he doesn't want me to finish, because I can't add anything to what's already been said. I guess I just highlight or underscore something really important Craig just said around this constant learning as you go and having the right intent and the right skills to be able to support people through the journey. And That's the bit I notice sometimes. If you have a high performance program, then you're only really holding yourself accountable to the output. And what I find then is that when output's good, questions don't get asked. And then when output deteriorates, or if you don't get the outcomes that you're looking for, then we start to ask questions, and it becomes very remedy focused. Like you're just trying to fix stuff. Where I like what Craig's talking about, because if you have a high performing intent where this is what we're trying to do, and it centers around us being vulnerable enough to and courageous enough to try and be the best we can be each day, then we also need to have conversations around when we're not doing that. And that creates room for growth, and it's far more organic, and it's far more bringing the best of people to interactions and situations, which in my experience on system level and day to day on the ground, that gets you to better outputs anyway, eventually. It also means that you're safer in those conversations, which we haven't really got on, but they do happen, when everyone's being the best they can be. But I referenced before, the bar is set by the performance demands. And sometimes you've got to have that conversation with someone where it's like, I don't think we're there, and I don't think we're going to get there. Like, those suck, those conversations, but they are so rewarding on a human level when you can sit there and look the athlete in the eye and know that you have done everything that you can do, and they have done everything that they can do. And the only limiter has been either the opportunities on the program or their performance potential. Those are the best endings, but I wonder how many times we just cut people off because they haven't hit a certain output and we don't really see what they were capable of.
I'd just close, if I can be as bold, to stretch us out a little, Dan. You really reminded me there, Elliott, of something profound for me over the years. So as part of this Medals are More or More Than Medals UK sport type drive now, like each sport is looking at their sort of slogan line to be the best, or their vision statement, mission statement. I think one thing that's become really prevalent to me and our team is, and perhaps this is why we're known to be doing okay in this area, is that it's one thing to put it on a paper, but to then go and have co-coaching conversations or co-practitioner conversations, transdisciplinary, of like, well, how did we calibrate against that in this practical situation when we had a tough challenge with an athlete today? How could we have been more person-centered? Like, unless we're calibrating at the root level down there, then I don't think there's any value in putting a statement anywhere. It's constant iteration, constant collective growth. And the biggest thing for me within that is open vulnerability. And we've not talked about vulnerability today, but the biggest thing for me, I mean, Elliott, you once cited me as being someone who's quite happy saying they don't know. And that's because I don't know a lot of things. But that shift towards vulnerability, I think if we can get that system-wide, it's a real positive thing. And yes, that doesn't stop us being challenging by any means, but it invites it, actually, because people feel a sense of belonging and togetherness on that journey.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for such a rich conversation. And I know that conversation will tap the interest of the audience, who will certainly be keen to get some more gems from both of you. I know you're both, as we've mentioned already, are keen users of social media to get your voices out there, to get some ideas and even throw some grenades into the room, as you mentioned earlier, Elliott. So how can people respond to those grenades? Elliott, how can people find you? What social media are you on, and how can they get in contact if you'd like to be contacted?
Yeah, I think Twitter is the best place, at Elliott Sports Site. Give me a follow, because I've also lost 1,000 cyclists that I need to replace.
That puts you in minus figures now, doesn't it, mate?
It does, yeah. Minus 900.
I'm going to be rallying the cycling community for you, Elliott. Don't worry, I'll get him back on board. He's all right.
The other thing I'd add, though, Dan, is because I've really enjoyed this conversation, but I know we haven't really tapped into some of the available literature out there. And I'll just say, if anyone's interested in this kind of well-being and performance stuff, there's some brilliant stuff that Dan Brown has put out on thriving, and there's some more recent stuff, which is a grounded theory of well-being and high performance that Sam Giles has just done his PhD in through the EIS. So yeah, some really neat ideas around like just defining and conceptualizing well-being and performance and how they come together practically. So I guide people in those directions if they're interested.
Well, you've guided me towards future guests on the Sports Like show. I remember I had spoken to Dan Brown about coming on, so I must resume that conversation. So thanks so much, Elliott. And to you, Craig, how can people find you on social media? And if you want to be contacted, how can you be contacted?
Yeah, sure. Similar to Elliott, not quite at the provocation levels just yet of Elliott on Twitter. Yeah, I'm on Twitter. That's probably the best place, Dan. So I'm at @MorrisCraig_, and also on LinkedIn at Craig Morris. So that's probably the best. We're always happy to have a chat. And been great to have an opportunity to engage with this community. So thank you.
Gents, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that podcast. That was Craig Morris and Elliott Newell. So thanks to them. As I say, I really did enjoy that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.